All right, guys. So the next video in the class, now we're just going to be focusing on really shading the one object. Now, the last video we did three tones essentially, and it was kind of basic shapes, and it kept it to a very simple three-tone value scale. But now we're going to start going into the more particular details of how to render a three-dimensional form with a light source. So for this project, you definitely will need to have a single object, preferably of one color. So you could also, I'm using the white cup here, you could use a brown paper bag, but something that doesn't have any distracting labels or anything like that. So try to get an object that's just one color so that you can really see the value structure and the differences in the tones. So I've done the measuring, and I've made a simple line drawing here of this cup, measuring my angles and my proportions. But now we're going to start talking about our object with a light source. So we do have that lamp, that one light source hitting this cup, and it's not hitting it directly right onto the object. As you can see, we have what's called a cast shadow. So that shadow is made by the object blocking that light at that angle, but that also gives us a really nice determinant of our table, our opposite plane to our cup. But to begin with, you're going to want to have either your mechanical pencil or the HB pencil, a charcoal pencil for building up the tones, and you'll want to have one of those rubbing sticks. You could use a paper towel, or a Q-tip is great too, and that's just to kind of blend some of our tones so we're not dealing with texture too much. And you're definitely going to want to have your eraser, so that you can either erase out highlights or rework a tone. Um, so yeah, definitely good to have a Q-tip if you don't have one of those blending sticks. Yeah, one of these guys. It's that blending stick. So as we look at this object as well, there is a bit of a highlight that occurs in some of these dark areas. So our dark tone, and it is porcelain, so there are some reflections, but it's interesting. It's always interesting when you have these objects. You always tend to see it's dark here, but there are plenty of these these highlights that are these lighter tones within the darker tones, and that's what we call reflected light. That's basically light that is actually hitting the tabletop that then reflects back onto the object, and it creates a bit of a lighter tone, especially around your darkest edges. Um, that three-dimensional form occurs due to the shifts in value due to things like reflected light. And you'll see that in certain areas, the contrast between tones is a bit more intense. So obviously down here, around this bottom edge here, there's that probably the darkest tone we're going to have. And that's where the least amount of light is. There's no light there, and there's relatively none being reflected into that area. Um, Another important tool to do is, as you're beginning to lay in your tones here, is squint at the object. Just squint your eyes, and what that does is it tends to simplify the value structure and actually take out a lot of the contrast so that you're able to get a pretty basic idea. And what you're doing is you're squinting, and therefore making your eye smaller. You're making your pupil smaller, which means less light is getting into your eyes, and it just simplifies the object. So I'm going to begin this by laying in tone with my charcoal pencil, and I'm going to start pretty light because you can always blend it with this. Alright, so I've laid in a pretty basic tone there, but you'll see also on the object with these shadows is that where these two tones meet here, this tends to be a bit darker. Um, so within these shadows, not only is there reflected light, but there is um, a distinct darker shade here, and that is due to the fact that there is all of this reflected light coming back into um, this shadow here on the back of the cup. So actually the darkest part of the shadow is actually going to be right here, whereas a lot of this is actually more reflected light. So I hope you can see that as this lighter tone, which is not the brightest tone in the object, by the way, but you see that dark area there really sets off those two areas. If you're a lighter tone, kind of a mid-tone, the darkest, almost the darkest tone of the shadow, and then it goes into reflected light and these other dark areas here. And you'll see down near the bottom as well, there is a lighter tone right up here. And once again, we're talking about reflected light. So you're really just looking at the details of the tones. Where is it lighter? Where is it darker? Where is it kind of smooth? And then where is like an abrupt change? So I'm going to start working on this cup, and I'll show you my progress. But notice that I've started with, just like in our previous video, a pretty basic setup. And now I'm just going to start working in with my blending stub, my pencils, and my eraser to really work in some of those attributes of reflected light and shadows. And the other thing that I want you to keep in mind is be aware of the shape of your cast shadow, because this really is what helps lay the groundwork, literal groundwork, of the three-dimensionality of the object. Because not only are you drawing the shadows that are on the object itself, but you also have to draw the cast shadow that this object makes on that perpendicular surface. So with those two things in mind, you really start to develop a three-dimensional object in a three-dimensional space. So I'm going to get to work.